Hello, health champions. Today, I want to talk about the number one absolute best way to prevent cancer. And if we want to prevent it, we need to know what's causing it. And there's usually 4 factors that they talk about. 1 is heredity. 2 is age. 3 is lifestyle. And number 4 is your environment. Now, the first one, heredity, you can't really do much about because your genetic makeup is what it is. Those were the cards you were dealt at the time of conception. Also, your age, you can't really change because you've been a certain number of years on the planet and time progresses. However, lifestyle, you have a tremendous influence over, and the environment, you have a lot of influence over. So, by improving your lifestyle and by reducing the impact of the environment, you can also change your genetic expression. You have a certain genetic makeup, but the expression depends on your lifestyle and the environment. Also, you can't change your chronological age, but you can change your biological age. You can change the expression of aging. We also need to know that cancer develops. It doesn't just happen. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It takes a long, long time. Most cancers are years or usually decades in the making. From the very first time that something happened to the time that they're detectable is usually in the decades. And in order for the process to complete from that initial event to a cancer, we need an initiator, we need a promoter, and we need progressor before it becomes really dangerous and life-threatening. And the initiator, that's that first initial mutation, because when a cancer develops, when cells become abnormal, there's a mutation in a cell. The DNA changes somehow. And things that cause that are called carcinogens, things that give rise to cancer. And the biggest category here are chemicals. We have over 100,000 chemicals in our environment, and there are dozens and dozens that have been classified as carcinogens. Pretty much in the class of pesticides are a lot of them, and also tobacco is the biggest single carcinogen that we know of. And it's not necessarily just the tobacco, but it is the smoke from the tobacco and the paper and all the chemicals that they put in these cigarettes as well. Another carcinogen is metals. So we have things like arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and nickel that are classified carcinogens. And also virus and bacteria, various different pathogens can create enough irritation to cause mutations. And we also have radiation, of course. And there's 2 kinds. There's UV radiation from the sun that affects the skin directly. And then there is ionizing radiation or radioactivity that can cause mutations deeper inside the body. So you may have heard people say that everyone has had cancer thousands of times in their lifetime, but the body takes care of it. So that's not exactly true. What they mean is that you've had thousands of mutations in your lifetime, but it takes certain steps. There's a long process for that mutation to become a cancer, and the body has several defenses along the way. So if you have one of these mutations, which we all have plenty of, then the next step is for the body to try to repair it. So you have a process, a built-in process of DNA repair. And if the body is successful in the repair, then we're good to go. If the body fails to repair, now we could have the beginnings of a growth, but what happens for the most part when that repair fails is that we have spontaneous death of that cell. It's self-destruct. It's called apoptosis. And very often that happens. But if that doesn't, then it is possible that we could get the beginning of a growth. But we're not done yet, because even if there were to be a beginning growth, now the body has an immune system. So we have T cells, killer T cells that can seek out abnormal cells and destroy them. And again, if that T cell is successful, now we're good to go, nothing happened. However, if that T cell misses it, if there's too many mutations, if there's too many factors creating quick growth, or if the immune system is weak or overwhelmed, now this growth can potentially keep going. And if there's enough factors to be beneficial for the promotion of that growth, now this could eventually turn into a cancer. But realize that we need multiples of these factors, and we need several different mutations for this cancer to develop and become really dangerous. And then we also need a promoter, which means something to help this tumor grow quickly. And these can be things like hormones, medication, and other chemicals. There are some chemicals that are not necessarily classified as carcinogens. They don't cause mutations, but they disrupt the body, or they help this tumor, these cells, grow faster. And just like every other cell in your body, cells need fuel to make energy to do what they do. And cancer cells need more fuel because they grow faster than normal cells. And the favorite fuel of a cancer cell is sugar. So one more reason to cut that sugar out. And in order for these cancers to get really dangerous, we also need progressors. And these are factors and circumstances that allow multiple mutations. These are factors that allow these changes to continue. And you won't get a really bad cancer without multiple mutations. And once they go through multiple mutations, now they are less orderly. They're less like the original cell. They are less confined. Like a cell usually has boundaries, but these cells don't really have those same boundaries. And because of all these changes, now this allows them to spread and infiltrate multiple other tissues. And of course, this is known as a metastasis. This is when it spreads. And you probably heard the terms benign or malignant, which basically means friendly or evil. And these have different characteristics. There are reasons that they're either friendly or evil. And the benign ones, they have a tendency to grow slowly, whereas the malignant will grow much faster. Also, the benign will be encapsulated. They'll have a confined boundary, and the malignant will be non-encapsulated. And also, the benign will be smooth versus irregular. So basically, what this would look like is a benign tumor would sort of look like this, and it would have a boundary to it. Whereas the malignant looks more like this because there's less control. It's gone through multiple mutations, so it's much less like the original cell. And these boundaries aren't really there anymore, so these cells just kind of slough off and spread all over the place. Another term for this is well differentiated. Like your normal cells are very well differentiated. They look like they're supposed to, whereas the malignant are poorly differentiated. They don't have much of a regular shape. They don't look anything like what they used to. And because of this, the benign cells are non-invasive. They kind of stay where they are, and they rarely cause that much health damage. They can become a nuisance. They can swell and get to the size of a basketball, but even then, they don't usually kill a person. Whereas once they're malignant and they start spreading, once they become invasive, then that's when they create damage. And this is also where the benign is called local, whereas the malignant tends to metastasize, to set up little colonies all over the place. Now, there are cases of cancer that have been reversed, very often called spontaneous remission. But cancer, along with dementia, are two diseases that you are so much better off to prevent than to try to reverse. Because once they have gotten to a certain stage, it's very, very difficult to reverse them. So in order to prevent it, the absolute best way is to understand holistic health. and to give the cancer fewer opportunities. So by controlling the initiators and the promoters and the progressors as much as we can, we really improve the odds. And the idea of holistic health is the triad of health. And this means that we address all aspects of health, all the things that can affect or stress the body. So we have chemical factors that can stress, we have structural mechanical factors, and we have emotional factors. And in each of these categories, there are factors, there are things that can help, that can improve our health, improve the odds, and there are things that can hurt the odds. And one of the first things you want to do is to limit carcinogens. So things like buying organic food as much as possible. And I know a lot of people are on a tight budget, so you don't feel that you can buy everything organic, but you do the best you can. And then you look at the Dirty Dozen versus Clean 15. So Dirty Dozen are the fruits and vegetables that they use the most pesticides. So those are the ones that you either avoid or you make sure that you buy organic. And then there's the Clean 15, which is the ones that they don't use a lot of pesticides. So you don't necessarily have to get those organic if you're on a tight budget. Also, a lot of people are just mindlessly spraying their yards. So they're polluting themselves all day long, and they're contributing to toxic chemicals that end up in the water supply. So don't spray the yard unless it's as a last resort, and always look for natural alternatives. More often than not, there are safer ways to get rid of those bugs. And the same goes for household cleaners and household chemicals. A lot of that stuff is super toxic, and find out if there are more natural alternatives, so don't pollute yourself. Also with cookware, you want to look for more natural materials like glass, stainless steel, ceramics, and you want to avoid things like plastic and aluminum because they leach molecules, they leach pollutants into what you're eating. And even with clothing, I just feel better when I wear natural materials. So basically everything I wear is either cotton, wool, or leather. I try very hard not to get plastic. Everything called performance these days, like t-shirts and training wear, and it feels like plastic when you touch it. I can't even stand that feeling. So I definitely prefer cotton, wool, leather, natural materials, and I think there is a reason I do believe that it is better for you. The second thing you want to do about cancer is to not feed it. And we said before that cancer cells use a lot of fuel. They use more than normal cells because they grow faster. And their favorite food is sugar, because most cells in your body can use one of two different pathways. They can use oxidative phosphorylation. It's a fancy word. It just means you're burning fat and carbohydrate in the presence of oxygen. Or when there is a crisis, you can use glycolysis and just break down sugar. So glycolysis doesn't work for fat at all. And cancer cells have a preference for this glycolysis pathway, and therefore cancer cells love sugar. They have a preference for sugar. They do use some of both, but they're leaning toward sugar and glycolysis. The third thing on the chemical side we have to be aware of is insulin resistance. So I talk a lot about that, and insulin resistance is closely tied to all degenerative disease. And here is one more reason. There's a very, very strong association between cancer and insulin resistance. And one of the reasons is that insulin is a mitogenic hormone. Mitosis means cell division, and genic is something that promotes or gives rise to. So insulin makes cells divide faster, and that's exactly what cancer cells love. So when something's mitogenic, it promotes cell growth, it promotes cell division, it promotes migration, and it inhibits apoptosis, this spontaneous cell death. When there's something wrong with the cell and it's supposed to die, well, insulin, which is a mitogenic hormone, it prevents that proper spontaneous cell death. And the fourth thing you can do, of course, is diet. And the first thing we want to address is fat, because if you look at the official guidelines, at the most of the mainstream advice, they're going to tell you that fat is always bad. But it's not true. The reason they think that is that garbage food has garbage fat. So if people get cancer because they eat garbage food and they become diabetic, there's going to have a lot of fat in that diet, but it's going to be garbage fat. So it's not the fat, it's the quality of the fat. In fact, if you learn what good fats are and you adopt a lifestyle of low carbohydrate, high fat, but you eat natural fats from meats and avocado and butter and coconut that have been very gently, if at all, processed, and they are either saturated or monounsaturated. Now they're a very, very safe and healthy fuel. And together with this, we have something called ketones and autophagy. So if you do low carb, high fat, if you do fasting and intermittent fasting, now you start developing ketones and a process called autophagy. And I've talked a lot about these in different videos, but real quick, these have anti-inflammatory signaling properties. So they will reverse the effects, all the deleterious effects of metabolic syndrome, of insulin resistance, of type 2 diabetes. When you have enough ketones and you develop enough autophagy, you will quickly reverse that process. And the ketones and autophagy also activates survival genes. The body shifts around priorities and it gets better at surviving and better at fighting off cancer when we induce the autophagy. So ketones are very simple to measure. You get a little blood stick, you get a little meter, and you can measure them. Autophagy is a little bit more difficult because it's more of a gradual process, but a good rule of thumb, a good landmark is to use something called a GKI ratio. It'll give you a good indication. And if you look at your glucose in terms of millimoles, so if you fast and you get your glucose down to about 3 to 4 millimoles per liter, which is about the same as 54 to 72 milligrams per deciliter. And then you also measure your ketones and you find those to be in the range of 3 to 4 millimoles, because that's the unit you will get. So you measure your glucose. If you have milligrams, you convert it to millimoles. You divide the glucose by the ketones. And if that ratio comes up anywhere around 1 or close to it, now you know that you have a very profound fasting effect and you're making a lot of ketones and you're getting a lot of autophagy. And typically if you do some fasting, it'll take 2, 3, 4 days to get the GKI ratio into this range. And there are several studies that show that you can shrink tumors and you can prevent cancer. You can reverse these conditions to some degree by getting into this state, by getting enough autophagy going. So I would recommend people do at least a 2 to 3, maybe 4 day fast 2 to 3 to 4 times a year. And I think that's a great step in cancer prevention, because not only are you fasting and reducing the insulin, which has all those mitogenic effects, but you're also, with the autophagy, you are also cleaning up, you're strengthening the body's defenses against emerging small cancer growths. And then we have the structural, mechanical aspects of health. We are made to move. We are made to exercise. And it doesn't have to be blood, sweat, and tears in the gym. It just has to be some sort of movement on a regular basis. And there is a strong association between people who exercise. They have much better survival rates for cancer. They have longer life expectations. They do much better whatever the cancer is. And we don't know exactly why that is, but there are many possible mechanisms. One could be that it does help reduce insulin. It may improve some other hormones as well. It does reduce stress because it stimulates the brain, which controls your stress responses. It improves immunity. Like we talked about, immunity is huge for actually cleaning out some of these developing cancers. It can even improve your microbiome diversity, which is important for immunity. And of course, it will improve circulation and help clean up. And perhaps the greatest general benefit is that it improves brain health, because after all, the brain regulates everything. And then we have the emotional side of the triangle, the triad of health. And this is basically about stress, that whenever we have stress, we feel bad. And we can put 1,000 different terms, descriptions on that. There are things that make you feel good. There are things that make you feel bad. And stress feels bad. So stress is often called the root of all disease because it's linked to every single disease there is. When we are stressed, we impair the body's ability to recover. And stress will also increase blood sugar, both through the effect of cortisol, but also through giving us cravings. It will increase inflammation, it will reduce digestion and your ability to absorb nutrients, and it will decrease your immunity, and with that, the T cells that can gobble up some of these early cancer growths. But the problem with stress is that most people think stress is out there. But we have to realize that stress is the way that we respond to things. Stress is the way that we perceive things. And these are conditioned responses. Now, the trick is that stress has basically become who we are. Through decades and decades of conditioning, we have a certain way of looking at things. And basically, the only way around that is to change who you are. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, that you have to become someone else, but you just have to become someone who interprets things differently, who has a different outlook. And we are very capable of change. So many of you watching have changed your lifestyle habits and you have become healthier. And when you go tell people what you've done, they basically ask you, have you lost your mind? Because you're doing something different. You're taking action and steps that are different from the mainstream stuff that isn't working. So losing your mind is not necessarily a bad thing if you do it on purpose. If you change, get rid of the old mind and get a new one. So if you have a tendency toward worry or anxiety, or if you just feel like stress is a big deal, or it could be, I would urge you to make it a big priority. Put it at the top of your list and devote some time to do this, to change who you are. Go ahead and lose your mind. There is a great book by Joe Dispenza called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, How to Lose Your Mind and Create a New One. And we have to understand that the mind is conditioned. It was programmed one way and we can program it another way. And one of the most powerful ways to do that, of course, is through meditation. But meditation, as powerful as it is, as much as I promote it and love it, it is also a skill and very difficult to master. So many people don't have the patience to get to the point where they get really good at it. And what we do in the office is we're measuring before and after, and we have something called brain tap, where we can measure changes, dramatic changes in brain and stress patterns in a single session. If you do something like that regularly, then that can have a dramatic impact on your stress. And I also have a little handout for you that can be really helpful. If you want to check it out, it's called 15 Signs and Symptoms of Enlightenment. I think you'll have some fun with that. And if you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. If you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.